Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. Today we'll be covering a whodunit slasher from 1998 that was no doubt inspired by the smashing breakout success of another successful horror franchise that had gained huge popularity just a few years prior. It's the story of a group of university students who, during a busy spring semester at school, find themselves entangled in an elaborate series of murders both on and off campus, where one by one, they fall victim to the killer in mysterious and over-the-top ways. These murders are meticulously planned and staged, and as investigators would soon find, they all share one distinct commonality. All of these murders are recreations of popular contemporary folklore, making for what's sure to be a grotesquely unique set of crime scenes. I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is Urban Legend. It's April 1998, and during a particularly rainy spring season in Melbourne, New Hampshire, local police respond to the scene of a particularly gruesome vehicular fatality. The body of university sophomore Michelle Mancini is discovered by police along a local highway, seemingly the victim of a single vehicle collision. Now, at the time of this discovery, police initially attribute Michelle's death to a simple accident. The night the incident occurred, it was raining heavily, no doubt resulting in slippery road conditions, as well as drastically reduced visibility. But upon further inspection of the vehicle, and questioning the last known witness to have seen Michelle alive, investigators instead begin to lean into another theory that Michelle Mancini may have in fact been the victim of murder. Crime scene photos and blood analysis show that Michelle was horrifically decapitated in the accident, no doubt killing her instantly. But experts ascertain that despite the likelihood that Michelle was traveling at high speeds at the time of her death, the impact damage to the body of the vehicle itself was not severe enough to warrant such a drastic trauma to Michelle's own body. And despite the driver's side window being smashed, the trajectory of the glass as well as the size of the shards themselves were probably not enough to completely remove her head. In addition, blood spatter to the driver's side door seems to indicate some kind of a large object or weapon being swung, resulting in unique patterns in the vehicle itself. Now, police proceed with canvassing the area for witnesses and ultimately locate and settle on the nearby establishment B&B service station, which was located just up the road. Though the proprietor of this gas station, who was later named as Michael McDonald, was initially sought by police as a potential suspect in Michelle's murder, he was actually ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing, and instead was able to provide a lengthy interview with police that seems to confirm investigators' worst fears. In transcript records obtained, this attendant indicates that Michelle Mancini did in fact stop at the full-serve gas station prior to her death, and that before hastily departing, this individual tried to warn her about something he saw that was truly chilling, that someone may have been concealing themselves in the back seat of Michelle's vehicle. Now, tragically, Michelle would speed away before hearing this crucial information that may have in fact saved her life. As police officially launched their investigation into Michelle's death, which was now deemed a possible homicide, news of her suspected murder has now reached the students and faculty at Pendleton University, notably published as front-page news in the campus newspaper, The Pendleton. Now, most prominently, these impacted students include a group of friends who would subsequently become future murder victims themselves. The victims and survivors in these gruesome campus murders include Natalie Simon, who the investigation would reveal had a dark past of her own, as well as her university friends and classmates. There was Paul Gardner, who ran the aforementioned school newspaper, newly transferred student Brenda Bates, dating couple Parker Riley and Sasha Thomas, as well as the class clown of the group, who was named Damon Brooks. Additionally, there was Tosh Ganeri, who was Natalie's on-campus roommate at the time of her death in 1998. Now, these victims also included two faculty members, both prominent individuals on payroll at Pendleton University. But the first victim to be murdered was, in fact, one of the students, and the crime would take place a mere 24 hours after the discovery of initial victim Michelle Mancini's body. Though his body would not be recovered by police until much later in the investigation, as was the case with numerous victims of the urban legend's killer, it's believed by police that victim and student Damon Brooks was killed the same night that surviving witness Natalie reported to have seen him in duress. Now, Natalie's statement to authorities recalls the two having driven to a remote location off campus, and after rejecting Damon's advances towards her, he then excused himself from the vehicle. After Damon didn't return for an extended period of time, Natalie starts to worry. You have to imagine this other student at Pendleton was already allegedly killed, and now she's out in the middle of nowhere and seemingly stranded. Her worries would soon prove to be well placed when she reportedly hears what she can only describe as some kind of a scraping sound on the roof of the car. Now, according to statements, Natalie claims that she saw Damon Brooks hanging from a rope above the vehicle, and that she was subsequently violently attacked by a masked assailant brandishing a double-bladed axe. Now, Natalie would later tell police that this attacker was dressed in a fur-lined and hooded parka, and that their face was seemingly hidden either by shadow or by a balaclava of some kind underneath the hood. It would be the same killer who would proceed to stalk and murder both students and faculty alike at Pendleton University in 1998, resulting in a body count of 8 total victims. Now, many question why at the time of witnessing Damon Brooks' apparent death by hanging, Natalie Simon failed to report these concerns to local authorities. However, it's important to note that records indicate that she actually did seek immediate assistance from University campus police officer Reese Wilson, who subsequently investigated the reported crime scene in question, but upon her arrival, Officer Wilson made a startling discovery of her own. There was nothing at the crime scene at all. There was no vehicle and there was no body, and no evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever. While it cannot be denied that the vehicle was there at some point thanks to tire imprints in the dirt and surrounding patches of grass, Officer Wilson deduces that Natalie may have been the victim herself to one of Damon Brooks' many elaborate pranks he was known to play on fellow students. Now, as controversial and as implausible as this theory might seem, witness statements taken by police do actually indicate that Brooks had a reputation across the school for committing such pranks and sometimes even interrupting various faculty lectures to do so, and they were often quite elaborate in nature. In addition, visa records and travel documents showcase that Damon was actually scheduled to attend a snowboarding event that weekend. So the majority of his friends and peers simply assumed that when he went missing, he was just out of town, hitting the slopes with his friends from school. However, as would eventually be revealed, Natalie had, in fact, witnessed the murder of Damon Brooks, and responding investigators conclude that his body was likely transported from the initial crime scene in his vehicle that was driven by the killer as Natalie fled for help that night. Damon's body was recovered from the final crime scene at Stanley Hall Dormitory, a location that we'll cover off shortly, and his ultimate cause of death was determined to be acute asphyxiation. Tissue damage on his neck is consistent with that of a rope burn, indicating, just as Natalie's reports initially showed, Damon was likely hanged with a rope until he expired. It wouldn't take long for the next victim in the case to be discovered. The body of victim Cautionary is discovered in her dorm room at Pendleton University. Copious amounts of blood are discovered on the scene, and as crime scene photographs clearly showcase, police find a chilling message scrawled on the dorm room wall, and it's allegedly written in the victim's own blood. Theorized to have been written using a paintbrush that was located as evidence from the crime scene, notably coated in the victim's blood, is the simple phrase, "Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the light?" And while investigators are initially puzzled at this apparent riddle of sorts, it actually doesn't take long for the pieces to fall into place, and that is largely in part to a witness statement that would be provided to investigators. The dorm room in question was shared with a roommate, and that roommate was none other than surviving victim Natalie Simon. Now, Natalie tells police that the night prior she returned home to her room to discover the space in total darkness, and seemingly that her roommate Tosh had some late-night company at the time. Now, not looking to disturb them, Natalie donned some headphones and just simply went to sleep. It wasn't until the morning after, as she woke up at approximately 8 a.m., that it was clear that she may have in fact witnessed Tosh's own murder, and miraculously, or perhaps even purposefully, was herself spared the same fate. However, initial police records here tell another story entirely, and also offer some potential insights as to why Campus Officer Wilson failed to formally file a report to Melbourne Police. In what's often an already heavily criticized case, from lack of police presence to mishandling of evidence, it's theorized at the time that Tosh had actually taken her own life, as responding coroner and paramedic teams indicate that Tosh's wrists had been slashed and that she likely died from acute blood loss. In addition, Tosh had been diagnosed as manic depressive and was taking excess amounts of prescribed lithium at the time of her death. Now, these conclusions drew some serious criticism, and while these first 3 murders had so far been written off as happenstance by the senior leadership on staff at the university, they were about to get a serious wake-up call. While the casualties in the case had so far been students at the university, the murderer would soon break their own MO and branch out to victims otherwise not associated with the core group of friends and acquaintances. As the police investigation is in full swing, 2 members of the faculty would go missing over the subsequent days, both of whom would eventually be discovered as victims of this killer in question. University Dean Adams was found alongside the other bodies at Stanley House Dormitory upon the conclusion of the investigation. Now, time of death records according to State of Decay indicate that he was likely killed within a mere 24 to 48 hours of the discovery of his body, and that his cause of death was the result of the partial collapse of his lungs due to curiously deep penetrative wounds found in his back that actually couldn't be matched to any kind of weapon that was located at the crime scene. The second faculty member recovered was that of prominent Professor William Wexler, whose body was discovered in the trunk of a vehicle belonging to university student and fellow survivor Paul Gardner. Now, Wexler's cause of death was from numerous blunt force trauma wounds to the body, likely the result of an attack with an axe that the killer was found to also have used in numerous of the other murders. And while his body was indeed found in the aforementioned vehicle, police reports suggest that Wexler was actually killed in his own office at Pendleton University, which was found to have shown both signs of a physical struggle as well as numerous blood pattern samples that DNA matched to Wexler himself. Now, it's worth noting here that on-site police officer Reese Wilson did, in fact, attempt to call in reinforcements upon the discovery of blood in Wexler's office. But due to the increasingly poor weather conditions outside, local authorities' response time was inconclusive, as they were reportedly responding to other urgent emergencies in the area. In addition to this, police logs and records indicate that prior to his death, Dean Adams had notified Melbourne police of an alleged prank going on at the campus, and that they might actually receive calls reporting false crimes over the weekend as part of this joke itself. Now, many theorize that this is probably done to protect the reputation of the school, which was actually recently noted as one of the safest schools in the country by local news outlets. Now, it would be a decision that may have actually resulted in more deaths at the hands of this campus killer. Now, police believe that the murderer transported and staged William Wexler's body within Paul Gardner's vehicle in an attempt to possibly avoid suspicion, and potentially even to pin these killings on Paul himself, hoping that they would get away with these heinous crimes. Now, ultimately, this ruse would prove to be unsuccessful, as the killer would soon have their own identity exposed, revealing their motive behind these horrible crimes, as well as their reasoning behind the specificity of using urban legends as their inspiration. But before this final confrontation with surviving victims in the case could occur, this campus killer would claim 3 more victims. And while the circumstances of 2 of these murders seem clear enough to investigators, the third proves to be puzzling and, quite frankly, disturbing. The former murders mentioned were that of local university host Sasha Thomas and her on-site technical advisor. Both of their bodies were discovered at the same crime scene, located in the recording booth on campus, where they would regularly broadcast their radio show that was titled Under the Covers with Sasha on WZAB radio. Sasha was found to have been killed by 3 impact wounds that are consistent with that of the same axe blade eventually recovered from the killer's person. Autopsy reports of the on-site technician are ultimately inconclusive as to cause of death. The final body discovered would be found at the final crime scene at Stanley Hall Dormitory, and it would be none other than fellow male victim and student Parker Riley. His manner of death is not only horrific in nature, but also probably the most mysterious in the case, as his actual time of death can only be assumed. Now, earlier in the evening, Parker was hosting a fraternity-like party at his attending dorm at Omega Sigma Phi Fraternity House, which held a wide variety of students who, after being interviewed by police following the investigation, did seem to confirm that Parker was seen alive and well for most of the duration of the gathering itself. At some point in the night, however, Parker just seemingly vanished. His friends noted that he appeared to be physically unwell, but they assumed that it was the possible result of intoxication or drug use, obviously quite common in that setting. Now, the reality would be far more grisly. During the autopsy of Parker Riley, coroners found his stomach to contain massive amounts of corrosive plumbing solution, commonly known as drain purge. In addition, traces of the edible candy Pop Rocks were also found to have been undigested in his stomach, indicating that they were likely consumed at the same time as the fatal and poisonous liquid solution. The tissue in and around Parker's mouth, including his gums and his lips as well as his esophagus, were also found to have been severely burned by corrosion, no doubt the result of this liquid entering his body. Now, to pause for a moment, many might be questioning the importance of such a hyper-specific detail as the brand-specific candy being found in the victim's stomach. However, this evidence is actually distinctly in line with the murderer's own kill patterns and the majority of the deaths that they were attributed to. And their actual motives for doing so would prove to be both complex and intertwined with both murder victim Michelle Mancini and surviving victim Natalie Simon. It's well documented at this point that the axe-wielding campus killer was actually none other than fellow student Brenda Bates. Now, Brenda had been specifically targeting those close to Natalie Simon, and in the majority of the killings, had used methods corresponding to then-popular urban legends, otherwise known as cautionary scary stories, that you might hear told around a campfire setting. Specifically, each murder was modeled after a popular folklore story itself. In the case of initial victim Michelle Mancini, it's the tale of the traveling passenger who's unaware of an assailant hiding in the back seat to kill them. For the murder of student Damon Brooks, the corresponding story involved a group of young lovers who parked their vehicle in a remote spot, only for the male victim to be hung from a tree above the car. And as the story goes, the female victim is only alerted simply by the sounds of his body scraping against the roof of the car as he swings back and forth above it. Tosh's death seems reminiscent of a popular folklore of a victim narrowly escaping death because they simply didn't turn on the light at the time, which sometimes also includes the death of an animal or a house pet in the story, rather than that of an actual human victim. And lastly, the death of Parker Riley is attributed to what's probably the most popular urban legend of all of them, and that's the simple rumor that if one combines Pop Rocks and soda, their internal organs would apparently violently explode. Now, it's unclear as to why other victims in the case seem to escape this trend, namely that of the faculty members at the school, as well as radio host Sasha and her technician. It's theorized by police that over the course of the various murders, Brenda Bates may have actually planned on keeping multiple alibis open, as she had intended on getting away with these crimes unscathed. Behavioral analysts suggest that it's most likely that Brenda had staged the crimes to have been falsely attributed to survivor Paul Gardner, as much of the fake evidence that she left behind pointed to his own involvement, including the murder of Dean Adams, who was, at the time, known to have been involved in Paul Gardner losing his job at the local paper. And it's also confirmed that the killer staged and commandeered Paul's vehicle at numerous stages of the crime spree, possibly to appear like it was Paul operating the car by any kind of witnesses that might have been present. However, at some point in the events, she may have also planned to implicate victim William Wexler, given his extensive knowledge on urban legends folklore that she may have hoped to use as evidence or connection to the theme of these crimes in question. It's possible that in her attempt to do so, Brenda either went too far or simply failed in her attempts to apprehend Wexler, resulting in his accidental death. But again, these are simply theories on behalf of psychoanalysts based on the evidence presented. In any case, the facts of the investigation indicate that Brenda Bates committed these murders, and their specific thematic design, as the result of a psychotic break at the loss of her high school sweetheart, David Evans. Now, to dive into the backstory here and hopefully provide some further context, David Evans and Brenda Bates were engaged to be married only 2 years prior to the eventual murders at Pendleton University. However, David would ultimately be tragically killed in a car accident, and police records obtained from the incident itself showcase an immediate connection in the eventual victims at Pendleton University years later. Both Michelle Mancini and Natalie Simon were actually best friends at Mountain Lake High School in 1996, and they were traveling together down a highway in New Hampshire in Michelle's vehicle late at night. And on this fateful night in particular, the duo were arrested by police for their partial involvement in David Evans' vehicular death. Police reports indicate that Michelle and Natalie intended to perform a prank on David, who at the time of the incident was completely unknown to them, by reenacting a popular urban legend. Now, this story in question was that of a vehicle traveling along the highway with its lights off, and when the opposing vehicle notices and flashes their high-beam headlights, which was a common courtesy to indicate to other drivers to turn their own lights on, this act of the no-doubt Good Samaritan is instead met with hostility, as the driver with their lights off instead pursues and kills the victim, and as the story goes, as part of a gang initiation. Now, their practical joke would have deadly consequences. It's stated that David Evans may have panicked as Michelle and Natalie raced towards him to reenact this folklore story, and as such he ran off the road, where he was killed immediately as the vehicle hopped a curb and subsequently flipped over. Michelle and Natalie were charged with reckless endangerment and received a minimal sentence of 1 year probation as a result of this fatal crash. Now, David Evans' violent death, combined with the lack of a trial or prison sentence for Michelle and Natalie, would serve as the motive driving serial killer Brenda Bates, as she not only sought revenge on her boyfriend's killers, but also to have them experience the same fear and torment that he no doubt experienced at the hands of this urban legend. Now back to the murders and the culmination at the Stanley Hall dormitory. As mentioned, police would eventually find 3 bodies here: Dean Adams, Damon Brooks, and Parker Riley. It's important to note here, the Stanley Hall dormitory had long since been closed and condemned at the university campus, so it's not really a stretch to think that Brenda Bates could have successfully hidden here for the duration of these murders. The dorm had been sectioned off due to a previous incident of violence at the school, during which an unnamed professor had a mental lapse and murdered numerous students before taking his own life. Now, this section of the campus couldn't be destroyed due to strict rules pertaining to historical heritage, so the faculty instead decided to completely board the building up and declare it condemned. This does explain how Brenda Bates was able to not only hide out here while she carried out the murders, but also how she was able to conceal and stage numerous bodies within without anybody noticing, as it was an area of the campus that was not frequented by staff or students. However, though the most talked about fact is often the discovery of these 3 victims themselves, a 4th survivor would also be located at the crime scene, and it would be none other than attending campus police officer Reese Wilson. She was found alive, but suffering from not only a laceration to her ribcage from a knife or stabbing weapon, but also extensive blood loss from a gunshot wound to her own torso, which was later determined to have been from her own pistol that was stolen and fired by the killer in question. Officer Wilson's statement provided to authorities indicates that she arrived on the premises during her routine patrol on the grounds, where she located the various bodies in question, as well as surviving victim Natalie Simon being accosted by serial killer Brenda Bates, who had allegedly planned on killing Natalie just moments prior. Now, Reese attempts to arrest Brenda Bates, holding her at gunpoint, but when a scuffle ensues, she's ultimately subdued and presumed dead after being stabbed and shot. Records from survivors Natalie Simon and Paul Gardner, the latter of which arrived at the crime scene after allegedly hearing the disturbance, indicate that at some point during this heated exchange in the confines of Stanley Hall, Natalie is able to wrestle the firearm away from the killer and proceeds to open fire on Brenda Bates with a single shot to the torso. The impact from the firearm results in Brenda losing her balance, where she tumbles through an adjacent window and tumbles a full 2 stories to the ground below. But in a twist that's almost poetic given the thematic nature of the murders in question, that wouldn't be the official end of Brenda Bates. Police would locate surviving victims Paul Gardner and Natalie Simon not at the crime scene at Stanley Hall, but rather on a bridge nearby, overlooking a river off the highway close to the university itself. Their vehicle, that was determined to belong to Paul Gardner, was found to have been totaled from a single vehicle collision, where reports indicate that it only narrowly managed to avoid tumbling over the bridge itself. And when police interview these survivors, they tell of one last harrowing altercation with the axe-wielding killer in question. In a well-publicized statement to police, no doubt in part due to the cinematic quality of the testimony, the victims indicate that Brenda Bates survived their initial encounter at the university and somehow had managed to conceal herself in the backseat of Paul Gardner's vehicle. And as Paul himself sped away from the crime scene with Natalie Simon in the passenger seat, reportedly in an attempt to reach medical assistance for the then mortally wounded Officer Wilson, Brenda Bates would make one final attempt on their lives, revealing herself in the backseat and viciously attacking them with her axe, the now infamous murder weapon that would be recovered as evidence from the vehicle itself. And while she would almost succeed in her crazed attack, Brenda Bates was ultimately killed when the vehicle lost control and crashed into the barrier on the bridge itself. She was reportedly ejected from the vehicle before landing in the flowing current of the river below. The surviving victims of the campus urban legends killer, Natalie, Paul, and Officer Wilson, all received extensive medical attention and psychological evaluation, where they were able to provide police with their own accounts of events leading up to the conclusion of the case. Officer Wilson was reportedly transferred to the nearby Alpine University, where she continued her duties as campus police. Now, we can't cover the case of the campus urban legends killer without mentioning the prominent fact that the body of serial killer Brenda Bates was not actually recovered by police. While authorities believe her to be dead, either from her wounds sustained in her numerous altercations with survivors, or simply from drowning in the steady body of water itself, they also credit the unsuccessful recovery results to the recent weather complications, as well as the flow of the river. Heavy rainfalls in the area no doubt only increased the rapid flow of current, and it's quite possible that Brenda's body was simply washed away completely. However, dead or alive, the story of Brenda Bates would take on a new life at Pendleton University and beyond, where rumors of these murders in question would circulate among both students and staff. And in an almost twisted and ironic way, the violent revenge story of this masked serial killer preying on the students and faculty with folklore-inspired crimes would become a bit of an urban legend in itself. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on Urban Legend. This movie's a totally guilty pleasure for me, and while it seems to get a lot of flack from horror fans, I think it's a pretty fun product of its time. As much as I love the 70s and 80s horror, there's just a different kind of vibe to the late 90s and early to mid-2000s era that really hasn't been replicated too often, in my opinion. The whodunit type story was heavily popularized at the time, and by the end of the trend, it would definitely be done to death, but in my opinion, Urban Legend ranks up there with the top 3 of the time period, second to I Know What You Did Last Summer, and the obvious champion and originator, which is Scream. The movie would go on to receive 2 sequels, the third of which takes a really weird supernatural turn, but if you're gonna check out only one in the series, it's gotta be the OG. At the time of this episode, Urban Legend isn't actually streaming anywhere that I could find, other than renting it off of Prime. But if you're a fan of the genre, and specifically of these 2000s era type horrors, definitely give it a whirl. It's a pretty fun ride, even if some of their raunchy humor and character archetypes probably haven't aged too well. It's also kind of funny to note that the movie was originally supposed to take place in the winter, which is why the killer wears that iconic winter parka. But when it was changed to a springtime setting, they just kept the costume the same and hoped that nobody would notice. It worked on at least one person though, because I didn't notice or care at all back in 1998 or when I watched it again for this podcast. It's a simple yet visually striking killer costume, so I guess that kind of cancels out all the obvious logistical shortcomings. Seriously, can you imagine how hard you'd be sweating in that thing? Oh man, it'd be gross. And that's it for today's episode. As always, I'm your host Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.